Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we are going to be taking a look at games which I am playing here in St. Louis in the Chess 960 event. Now Chess 960, also known as Fischer Random, is a very unique variant of the game of chess in that there are 960 different starting positions where you arrange all of the pieces on the back rank. For example, the setup that you see right here on the board where the king, the knight, the rooks, and everything are arranged differently. Now, the day did not go great for me. However, in the second round, I was playing against Garry Kasparov, the former world chess champion and one of the greatest players of all time. Now in this game I am playing with the black pieces, so let's jump right into it. Now before we talk about the specific game itself, one thing that I do want to point out is that in Fischer Random there are a couple of themes that do generally exist. Now number one is that you try to still control the center, normally with e4, d4, c4. However, as we learn over time and we play more with computers, one of the things that is a little bit unusual, sometimes when you have a queen in the corner and the rook next to it, whether it's h1 and g1 or whether it's b1 and a1, sometimes you do actually push pawns in front of the queen and the rook on the edge to try and gain space. So Garry starts out by playing g4. I play pawn to c6, plays this move c4, trying to prevent me from taking the center with d5 on move 2. Now here I played g5. Originally I did not want to play this move. However, the move that I initially thought was h5, but after g5, g6, for example, once white plays e3 here, threatening to take space in the center with either f4 or d4, if I do play e5, now white can go knight c3 or knight g3. There's knight popping on e4, and then there's these big threats with knight f6 next move, so it feels very hard to play for black. So after calculating that, I decided to play this move g5 here. Now after playing this move g5, Garry plays pawn to h4, I take back, he takes, and now I play d5, taking the center because white will no longer be able to capture the pawn on d5 with the queen on h1. So Garry trades on d5, and now he plays this move knight c3, which is a big mistake. Now, one thing that's very important about 960 is that you have to use your time very, very carefully. Now, in this game, in this position, I chose not to use my time carefully, and I played this move e6 after I want to say 10 seconds, just looking at the clock usage. And as soon as I played e6, I realized that why didn't I play this move d4? Now, d4 would have been a very, very strong move because after white plays a move like knight e4, I can now play h5, taking advantage of this pin on the g file, and I'm threatening to win the pawn on g4. Additionally, if white plays a move like knight d5, I can play the very simple bishop d6, stopping the checkmate in one threat on e7. And after that, the knight on d5 will be in a very precarious situation because I can play queen e5. I can also play bishop e6, and this knight is just very, very loose here. So I really should have played d4, but instead I played e6, and Garry, to his credit, now plays this move e3 here, which prevents this d4 pawn push. And additionally, after I play a move like knight c6, white will be able to close the center off by playing a move like d4. So I play knight g6, Garry goes queen h5, and now I play knight to c6, and he plays g5 here. Now again, Garry resists playing this move d4, which is important to note because now if I play d4 after knight to e4, there are again big threats towards this f6 square because the pawn is on e6, not e7. Whereas if we go back to this position after d4, knight e4, or knight d5, regardless, the pawn on e7 stops all the threats on f6. Whereas in the game here, after g5, d4, knight e4, I can never move this pawn back, so the idea of d4 is never going to be effective anymore. So after g5, I play bishop d7, Garry plays d4. Now here I play this move a6. Initially, I wanted to play bishop d6 and castle long. However, white can now play knight to b5, attacking the bishop. I can't really go to e7 because then there's a fork with knight c7. And if I check and we trade bishops here, after I castle, white can play knight d6 check, king c7, knight takes f7, again with another fork, and white would be completely winning. So I play this move a6 very prophylactically to stop knight b5, and then my plan is to play bishop d6 and castle long. So after a6, Garry goes knight e2, a very, very good move, showing that Garry has fundamentally very good understanding, even though he has not played professional chess in nearly two decades, 19 years roughly, that he has not played professionally. But knight e2 is a very strong move because white is trying to go knight g4 and knight f6. So I play bishop d6 here, Garry plays knight g4, and now I have to go bishop e7 to stop this threat. He now goes bishop d2, I castle long, and here Garry makes a mistake. He plays his move rook h1 after a long think. Now, one way that the game of chess has definitely changed versus the past, and in particular when you're playing rapid and blitz, is you sometimes have to be very pragmatic about your time usage. Now at this point, Garry was already moving a little bit slower than me, but he used nearly 5 minutes to play rook h1. Now again, as we know, Garry was the best prepared player in the history of chess. He was very good at getting advantages out of the opening and then just blowing people off the board after that. However, when you're playing Rapid and Blitz, sometimes you have to be a little bit more pragmatic as opposed to spending a lot of time to try and find the absolute best move, because at the end of the day, if you get really low on time but the position is not completely winning, it's going to be very hard to beat a top level player. So Garry uses 5 minutes to play rook h1. Now here I played this move rook g7 very quickly. I used maybe 2 minutes. Again, not the best move. What I should have played was bishop e8, but the reason I rejected this move is that after queen takes h7, if I trade the queens, I take on g5. After white takes on g6 and plays a move like rook c1, position is about balanced after king b8, but we're in an endgame, and at this point with the position being so simplified, the chances of me winning are very low, and after losing the first game of the day to Hikaru and Mamedyarov, I wanted to keep more pieces on the board and try to complicate matters. So instead I choose to play rook g7, guarding the pawn on h7 this way. Now Garry plays a3 here. I go king b8. Worth noting, white can't play bishop d3 either, for the exact same reason that I could not play bishop d6, which is that now I can go knight b4. Bishop cannot move to e2 because of this fork on c2, and white would have to go back to b1, and he doesn't want to do that. So he plays a3 himself, trying to prevent knight b4, and then next move he can play either bishop d3 or bishop c2. So now I go king b8 here, and Garry plays this move bishop c2 after a fairly quick think, but again, he used 3 minutes to play his a3 move, which was not great. And as soon as Garry played bishop c2 in the game, he started shaking his head very vehemently. Now, it's very tough sometimes with a player like Garry who is very animated, because sometimes you don't know, is it trying to elicit a reaction, get a fast move, maybe you make a blunder, or what exactly is going on. So when Garry started shaking his head, I wasn't sure whether he thought he'd blundered something or whether he was trying to induce me to move very quickly and respond with the blunder in kind. Now after this move, I used a bit of time here to play this move e5. Now in retrospect, I think this was a mistake for a couple of reasons. First of all, at this point in time, the position is very complicated. It's not really clear what the plans are for either side, but additionally, I am up 8 minutes. So when you're up a lot of time on the clock, your opponent's getting low, you generally are trying to avoid simplifications or clarity in terms of what's going on. Now in this position, I have the pawn break with e5, but the move that I should have played, which keeps a lot of the tension in the position, is the move rook c8, because now if white tries to castle long here, I can go queen d8, targeting the pawn on g5 first of all, but additionally I have ideas like knight a5, knight c4, and queen b6 as well to try and create some checkmate patterns towards his pawn on b2 and the king on c1. And if this were to happen, it's very unclear how white is supposed to respond, because white can't really play e4 because that hangs a pawn on d4, and this threat of knight a5, knight c4, and queen b6 would have caused Garry to use a lot of time. So without the clarity, I should have made this decision instead of what I did in the game, because in the game when I play this e5 move here, after Garry goes knight f6, there's going to be clarity, because if I take on d4, the center is simplified here. It's white's either looking to take on d5, or if I take on d4, castle. There are a lot of straightforward ideas in terms of what is going on here. White can also play knight takes d5 here as well, and it's very tricky in terms of what my plan is, and Garry really only has to look for like 1 or 2 moves in any given position. So this is a very big mistake by me playing e5, and I did regret it almost as soon as I played it, because once Garry played knight f6 here, I realized that the position is going to become simplified, and Garry, even at the age that he's at, if a position is simplified, his instincts, his intuition are still very sharp. You don't play chess for 30 plus years and suddenly forget everything overnight. So I wasn't very happy as soon as this happened. So I played bishop e6 here to guard the d5 pawn. Garry plays knight e2, and now here again I played a move that I would regret almost as soon as I made it, which is I played this rook c8 move after a couple of minutes of think. Now what I should have done is I should have traded and played rook g8, and if white goes bishop c3 for example, now after e4 this f6 pawn is very weak. Now white is still better after f3, but it's not as straightforward, whereas in the game, when I play this rook c8 move, Garry goes bishop c3, I try to play e4, again a very inexplicable move by me. I should have taken on d4, because now if white takes with the knight here, I can take, and he cannot recapture with the bishop, because then you lose the bishop on c2. And after pawn takes here, I can play something like bishop d6, again with ideas like queen d8 and queen b6, and white really doesn't want to castle here, and it's just generally very hard to play. But instead, I play e4, completely overlooking this f3 move, which Garry played, I believe, relatively quickly. Very strong move, because now the center is opening up here. And after pawn takes, queen takes, white can even try to play e4. And additionally, I have this big weakness on h7. The queen on h8 isn't doing much. The rook on g7 also completely useless. And white is just clearly better here. Fortunately for me at this point in time, Garry was low on the clock, however. So now I play queen d8, Garry plays knight g3, trying to trap my rook on g7. Now apparently here, I have an unbelievable tactic with knight to e5, pawn takes and rook c3, or maybe the computer's crazy, but apparently after takes, I have some knight e5 and rook g5. Now if white takes the rook, there's a nice fork with knight f3. And if white takes on h7, I guess there's some tactic with queen c7. Don't ask me to explain this. Apparently I'm down 2 rooks for a bishop, but maybe there's counterplay. Again, very, very wild line. I did not even contemplate this during the game, but the computer says that it's maybe playable. Instead, I play bishop takes f6. Again, if I were to play a random move like king a8 after knight to h5, I'll have to take here to not lose the rook. Rook g8, he just takes, and otherwise he captures. And after takes, queen takes f6. Now I have to trade the queens here, and after pawn takes, rook g8, knight g7. White is probably winning because the h7 pawn is under attack, and I can't really guard everything here. So I play bishop takes f6, Garry takes with the queen, and now I play queen to c7. Of course, Garry's low on the clock. I don't want to trade the queens here because in an endgame, this will be very easy for Garry to play, and he has no issues in the position. So instead, I play queen c7, offering to give the rook in return for the knight on g3. And if this were to happen, it's actually winning because after king d2, I can now go queen g2 check. And if white goes to the back rank, I capture the rook. And if white goes to d3, I can go bishop f5, e4, and there's probably some checkmate in here. I don't see it right off, although actually knight f4 is the easiest one. King e3, queen e2, king takes f4, queen f2, and this is checkmate because the king cannot go anywhere here. So Garry, of course, plays king f2. Very, very good move, solves the king situation, and keeps all the pieces very, very active. So I go rook g8, he takes on h7, knight f8, goes rook h6 here, and now I go king a8. Again, trying to dodge this queen f4 trade of the queens. If I play knight d7, queen f4, this is maybe okay, because I think I can maybe take and take. But again, after takes rook c2, king e3 or king f3, I thought Garry was better here. Apparently there's also just bishop h7, which is winning, but at any rate, I'm trying to avoid a trade of the queens because Garry is low on time, and he was very panicky here. Again, I think when you don't play that much chess and you're not sharp, it's very easy to become concerned and worried when you get low on time. So after rook h6, I go king to a8 here, and now in this position, Garry plays this move, rook g1. I don't know if this is the best move, but it makes sense. Probably rook h1 makes a little bit more sense to go rook h8, but he goes rook g1, play knight a5 here, trying to activate my knight. Knight e2 is played, I go knight c4, he plays bishop d3. If white plays knight f4 here, I can maybe go knight d7, and after queen e7, I thought knight b2 is maybe good, but even rook g e8, queen b4, and knight takes e3, and after king e3, there's apparently bishop g4. I thought bishop f5, which is also probably good enough because the king is in check, the bishop is loose on c2, and the knight on f4 is under attack. So Garry correctly plays bishop d3. I go queen d7 here. Now we get rook h1, play knight g6 back. He plays knight f4. Worth noting, white does not want to get greedy and take on g6 because after pawn takes, if white takes the pawn on g6, I have rook f8 winning the queen. And if white goes knight f4 here, I have rook cf8 trapped in the queen because if queen takes, you can't capture the queen because that puts the king on f2 in check. And you can't go to e5 because the knight on c4 covers the square. So Garry plays knight f4 here, we trade. Now I play knight d6. Apparently queen a4 is the best move. Again, very, very random line. I think the idea is because after rook h8, there's some kind of knight b2 takes and queen b3 attacking both bishops. A very, very dank idea that doesn't make any sense. So I play knight d6 here, preventing f5 instead, and threatening to maybe play knight e4. So here Garry goes rook h8, I play knight e4, we get the trade, we trade all the rooks off the board, and we get to this critical position after bishop d5. Now, white is better here, perhaps even winning after a move like king g3, but there are technical difficulties due to the opposite color bishops here. So Garry goes f5. Now I play b6 here, which is maybe not the best move, but the reason I did this is because I felt like at this point, I'd love to go queen b5 here, but after a move like bishop b4, white has this very strong idea of bishop c5, and now if I go b6, I thought maybe he could play queen c7. Apparently, I can just block, but I thought by playing b6 here, maybe I go a5, I prepare queen b5, and any of these ideas with bishop b4 and bishop c5 no longer exist. So now Garry goes a4, a bad move, by the way, because after a5, now my king is going to be very comfortable on a7 or a6, and I can look to play queen c6 and queen c4 and queen d3 here. So now we get king e3. I play bishop b7, threatening to capture on a4, because of course if I take right away, that would hang the bishop on d5. So I go bishop b7. Now Garry goes b3, and the reason that I say this was bad is because now after queen d8, the bishop is going to be very loose, g5 is loose, and if we go back to this position right here, everything is very solid. The bishop on c3 can never be attacked because the pawn on b2 guards it, pawn on a3 is guarded, but once the pawns have to start moving now, g5 is weak, I can go queen c8 to target the bishop, and it's a little bit tricky to play. So Garry goes f6 here, which is a mistake, because now I go queen c8, and the problem is now the queen is getting in. It's a classic right triangle. I'm targeting the bishop on c3, but I also have queen h3 check as well. So Garry plays d5 to guard the bishop with the queen on e5. I go queen g4, plays bishop d4, play queen f3, and now I play a couple of checks, and I decide to check and take on b3. And already, this game is spiraling very much out of control, and what Garry probably should have done here is try to bail out with a move like bishop e3, and after queen takes here, takes, for example, this should lead to a draw. Apparently, there's some queen f4 move that's very good, but it's already at the point where Garry should be very careful and try to bail out. Instead, he plays d6, I go queen c2, king g3, and now I play this e3 move, which is completely insane and makes no sense at all. Now, the reason I play this is because after queen d3, I noticed that Garry could run the king to the edge of the board on h4, and I suddenly noticed there's also a very big threat here of something like queen a5 check, and I can't capture because then my king would be in check, and it's very hard to play. So I decided to play e3, which is a huge blunder, because here white actually has a way to win with bishop takes pawn, king takes, queen b5, king a7, queen takes a5. And the reason this is lost is if I play a move like king to b8, for example, or let's just say bishop a6, white can check to trade the queens, and after king b8, white goes queen c7, takes, and now this move g6. And if I take on g6, the pawn gets through. If I play bishop to d5 to guard the pawn, then white goes g7 and g8 and gets a queen. So I basically can't do anything. And if I play bishop e4, he takes and goes f8 as well. So this would have been GG. Now Garry, very low on time here, he blunders with queen takes pawn, and now after queen g2, the game should be a draw because I should be able to just check forever without white being able to prevent all the checks. So I go queen h2, queen g3, I check, goes here. Now I play queen a2. And again, the problem is I have checks on d5 and e6 here, and it's just very, very hard for white to do anything. Once again, at this point, I feel like Garry probably should try to bail out. He goes king f4, I play queen d5, and now he plays the inexplicable king e3 move. What he should have played here was this move queen e3, and after queen takes d6, let's just say something like bishop e5, queen b4, and then queen d4. And the game should be a draw, or even bishop d4 here. And after a move like bishop d5, preventing this pawn push because I can take, all roads basically lead to equality here. However, Garry, low on time, a lot of tension going on. He plays this move king e3 very quickly, which blunders this unfortunate move queen e4 here. And now white is going to lose the bishop on d4. Garry plays king f2. And after queen d4, king f1, bishop e4, he has to resign the game in lieu of the fact that he's down a bishop, and white's never going to be able to get these pawns to the end of the board and make a new queen. So with that, I won the second game of the day against Garry Kasparov, the famous world chess champion, probably I would say the second greatest player of all time. And it's very nice to win a game. Obviously, winning like this against Garry, it's not really how you want to win, of course, but it's a win, and that's that. So I won the second game. Unfortunately, the third round of the day, I would lose basically out of the opening to Nepomniachtchi. Came with a very inspired exchange sacrifice. So I win one game. I lose two games here on day one of the St. Louis 960 chess event. But I do get a win against Garry Chess, so it is what it is, as we like to say. I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. I'm not sure if I'll be doing lengthy recaps or just like game by game. We'll figure out what exactly the plan is. But again, if you have not subscribed to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button below, and hopefully we'll have some more recaps on the next 2 days from the Chess 960 event here in St. Louis, Missouri. See you guys.